Hi, my name is Mickey Stelder, and you're listening to part 2 of the lecture COVID-19 at Sea, Ships and Crisis. Part 2, the virus, the dinghy, the refugee, whose lives are rescuable during a pandemic. The financial collapse of the cruise industry and its passengers have received quite some attention since the outbreak of the coronavirus. At the same time, small, dangerous dinghies and small boats carrying refugees from the African continent and the Middle East to Europe, and from Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh to Thailand, Indonesia, and Malaysia, disappear beyond the horizon of the coronavirus spectacle. In this section, we will have a closer look at the relation between the pandemic and the small boats with refugees. Their disappearance from the horizon begs the question, who is rescuable under the pandemic's politics of containment? What ships are visible, and who on the ship is worth grieving? The small ocean-crossing boats of refugees reveal the tension between national jurisdiction, sovereignty, international maritime law, and the racial, xenophobic politics of containment and contamination. The terms politics of containment and politics of contamination allude to the ways in which COVID-19 regulations and measures render certain peoples and populations more equipped to combat and survive the virus, while leaving others vulnerable and prone to premature death. These distinctions often operate along racial, caste, religious, gendered, class, and citizenship lines. On April 16, the Royal Malaysian Air Force spotted a small boat approximately 70 nautical miles, about 130 kilometers, west of the coast of the Malaysian island Pulau Langkawi in the Malacca Strait. The boat, attempting to reach Malaysia, contained over 200 refugees, predominantly women and children. The refugees had fled the overcrowded camp Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, where they were stranded after facing persecution and genocide in Myanmar. Noor Hussain, a Rohingya community leader currently residing in Balukali refugee camp, has said that the coronavirus situation has rapidly deteriorated an already untenable situation in the camps. There are no outbreaks of the virus, but the strict lockdown, block on movement, and mobile internet has brought people in the camp to reach out to human traffickers to help them escape to Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand. Upon spotting the small boat in its waters, the Malaysian Air Force contacted the Royal Malaysian Navy, who intercepted the vessel in order to prevent it from entering Malaysia's territorial waters. The fate of the boat that was turned away by Malaysia's Navy ships remains unknown. That same month, 400 refugees attempted to sail to Malaysia, but were turned away by the government. Their boat set course for Bangladesh, but they ran out of fuel, water, and food, and floated around the Bay of Bengal for 2 months before they were rescued by the Bangladeshi Coast Guard. The starving survivors are now in quarantine in Cox's Bazar. Many had not survived the journey. These examples are 2 of many small boats carrying refugees floating around the Indian Ocean and the Andaman Sea in search of a port to dock. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and other North American-based NGOs urged the Association of Southeast Asian Nation member states to dispatch search and rescue operations and monitor the situation closely, allowing refugees adrift at sea protection under international law. In order to understand the motivations for the Malaysian government to push the boats out of its waters, we need to turn to the United Nations Law of the Sea Convention of 1982 and its construction of the ocean into 7 different zones, each zone indicating a different legal sphere. So let's have a look at how these 7 zones are defined using the example of Malaysia. The Malaysian Maritime Region consists of its internal waters, its territorial sea, its contiguous zone, its exclusive economic zone or EEZ, and its continental shelf. In the first 3 zones, the Malaysian state holds full sovereignty, while other vessels have the right of innocent passage and navigation through these waters. In its EEZ, Malaysia holds sovereign rights over the management of resources of the seabed and the water column. And in its continental shelf, Malaysia holds sovereignty over the seabed, but not the column. In these 2 zones, other vessels hold the freedoms of navigation, of overflight, of laying submarine cables, and in the case of the continental shelf, revenue sharing. The last 2 zones are the high seas and the deep sea. Under international maritime law, no state holds sovereignty in these waters. The deep sea itself is defined as the common heritage of mankind, thereby rendering it available for exploration and resource extraction by any state. The distinction between national jurisdiction and the high or the free seas is derived from the work of the 17th century Dutch legal scholar Hugo Grotius, who used this distinction to legitimize Dutch colonial ventures in the Indian Ocean, ironically, in the very place where Rohingya are now trying to seek refuge. The UN Law of the Seas Convention makes no mention of refugees adrift at sea. Keeping international maritime jurisdiction in mind, what motivated the Malaysian Navy to push the boat carrying 200 Rohingya refugees out of its territorial waters, and most likely also its contiguous zone? Within the territorial sea and contiguous zone, the Malaysian state holds sovereignty, which also means it has jurisdiction to prevent or punish infringement of customs, fiscal, immigration, or sanitary laws, while at the same time it carries the responsibility for rescuing persecuted minorities adrift at sea under the principle of non-refoulement. This principle is part of the United Nations Refugee Convention of 1951 and its 1967 protocol. Even though Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia have not signed these documents, the principle of non-refoulement is part of customary international law and is therefore binding on all states. Across the globe, coastal states are using the outbreak of COVID-19 to fortify their crackdown on oceanic flows of forced migration under the banner of containment measures, border closures, and social distancing. Yet, the issue of coastal states pushing refugee boats back to the high seas extends beyond the outbreak of the pandemic. The statement of the Royal Marine Air Force following the ship's interception said that it was feared a group of what the government called 200 foreigners huddled together on the vessel might bring COVID-19 to the country. The statement also said that on humanitarian grounds, the Navy presented these foreigners with food and water before pushing the vessel out of the country's waters. The COVID-19 scare, in this case, is used as a rhetorical device to legitimize the killing and letting die of refugees adrift at sea. According to the Navy's statement, the Navy and Air Force's concerted efforts are part of a larger scheme of the RMAF, the RMA, and the Malaysian Maritime Enforcement Agency to protect the country's maritime security and sovereignty. These efforts will now be intensified as boats with foreigners continue to arrive in Malaysian waters. It comes perhaps as no surprise that the Malaysian Maritime Enforcement Agency Academy receives its training from the United States Navy. Turning to the small boats carrying refugees across oceans in search of safety shows not simply who's left behind, who's left to die, and whose deaths remain invisible. What we witness here is, in the words of Gay Theresa Johnson, a criminalization of the unprotected that draws attention to a particular political and economic calculus at work within the politics of containment. Disputes around oceanic crossings of refugees and migrants have been an issue for over a century. A case in point is the story of the SS Komagata Maru, a vessel that carried 376 Punjabi migrants, at that time subjects of British Empire, to Canada. In 1914, the ship drifted around Vancouver's coal harbour for 2 months before it was sent away and sailed to Calcutta, where the British colonial army slaughtered the passengers upon arrival. In the case of the Komagata Maru, the ship was turned away on the basis of Canadian colonial racial laws aimed at preventing South Asian subjects of British Empire from migrating to Canada. In the case of the coronavirus, emergency legislation steeped in a politics of containment that is explicitly racialized and xenophobic prevents refugees from docking their boats in coastal states. Where COVID-19 and cruise ships have complicated and hardened the boundaries of the nation state, in the case of boats carrying refugees, those borders were already firmly in place. Where in the case of the cruise ship, the ocean becomes a site of containment for passengers and a carceral site for most of the crew, in the case of the refugee dinghy, the ocean becomes a graveyard. The ocean as a graveyard is of course reminiscent of histories of the slave trade, which resonate with today's disappearance of thousands of black and brown refugees adrift across the world's oceans, who are fleeing the consequences of colonization, failed decolonization, or state persecution. The COVID-19 outbreak has reified disputes around who needs to take responsibility for refugees in distress at sea. The current COVID-19 outbreak shows how national sovereignty and ocean governance interact and how they are, to quote Elizabeth Johnson, legally, materially, and symbolically co-constitutive. Angela Davis argues that the intensification of border policing during the pandemic shows that, quote, the nation state as we know it is no longer possible. The people being left to die at sea question not just the limitations and validity of the nation state in pandemic times, but also the validity and use of contemporary understandings of sovereignty and responsibility as they are enshrined within the framework of international law and international maritime law. Questions that we might want to ask may not simply be how coastal states can be held accountable under international law, but also what contradictory legal structures are in place that enable governments to reject responsibility for the murder of Rohingya and other refugees adrift at sea. What challenges does COVID-19 present for our contemporary understandings of international maritime law? When states increasingly lock down and lock in, what access to legal recourse and protection is there for those adrift at sea? If the legal structures that are there are not fully binding, what kinds of transformations might we want to envision? Turning to lockdown from a national self-preservation perspective leaves many people behind and exacerbates rising nationalisms and border policing. People are left behind not just inside nation states, but also at their maritime borders. What other ways of thinking about movement, protection, and sovereignty are warranted under these ongoing conditions of invisible displacement, lockdown, and death?